Like I said, we're jumping into the book of Daniel, and this is just, it's an amazing book, and we can learn so much about God, so much about who we are, and the way the world is and how God meets us in the process. Entitled this, Stranger in a Strange Land. And I think it's important to remember the backdrop of this, because I think maybe from the flannel graph era or Sunday school or, I don't know, Veggie Tales, I'm not sure wherever you come into the picture here, we get the picture that Daniel, it's this magical fairy kingdom, and it's just all these exciting adventures happen, and he's in the king's palace, and it's wonderful. And we need to recognize that life went down as a Jewish POW. That's really the story of the book of Daniel. When life is not going as you thought it would or hoped it would, when things are completely out of your control, and yet God is as active or more, and we're availed to Him that much more. And so really to have that sense of context and appreciation. Strange, coming up on near 3 years here at Bethel. I know it's buyer's remorse already. It's hard to believe. No, it's God's mercy or discipline or something. I'm not sure. But the I mean, it's still we're still pinching ourselves. It's a great blessing to be here. But in just reflecting on the journey thus far, I think I've shared with some of you. I've lived in 35 different homes in my life. That it's just been continual change and moving and putting down roots and picking them up and putting down roots and picking them up. I grew up as a Marine Corps brat, so my father, a career Marine, got transferred all the time, and that's just what happens. And over time, where you'd see certain families at different posts and different basis, I noticed as I got older that most of the MKs, the military kids, divided into two categories. Because all of us lived in that many houses. All of us were continually changing. We're always the new kid at school. But over time, there were these two categories. One was a sense of people that just kept to themselves. People that really hard to get to know, were pretty invisible. And talking to them, they'd say, well, what's the point? What's the use? Why make friends? I'm just going to lose them. I'm just going to get hurt. Why get used to this place? Because as soon as I get used to it, we're going to be going anyway. And it was just sort of giving up already. And then there was another group that would say, even if I'm only going to be here a year, I'm going to lay hold of this. I'm all in. I want to know as many people. I want to have the best friends that I can. I want to just get involved with whatever's going on. And I think trying to understand why there are these two groups, one of the things that was apparent was those that had a clear sense of identity. That their identity wasn't based on where they were from necessarily. Their identity wasn't based on the number of friends that they had at that particular point in time. And it wasn't even based on just what everybody else was wrapped in, but there was a clear sense of who they were. For the kids that could jump in and be all there, they knew who they were. They could grow in any environment. They could sprout up and flourish wherever they were. And it was just, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Now, how much more would that be the case for us in life, where much of life we don't have control over? We really ultimately don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. We have no control really over the government, although, election, there's some, I suppose, over the economy, over what's going on in the world, the undulations of our heart, relationships. One phone call can really change the rest of your life. And so in this midst, do we understand who we are? What is our identity? What makes us us? And in doing so, can we flourish wherever we are, in whatever circumstances? Is our fullness, our health, our vibrancy only dependent on our circumstances? In other words, if this is in order and this is in order and it's going this way and I did this, okay, and I've taken these steps and now this is in place and now finally I can start living? Or is it a sense of, irrespective of what's currently going on or how long I'm going to be in this situation, can I bloom, can I grow? It's a very simple phrase, puts it this way: we're to bloom where we're planted. Okay, this just happens automatically in nature, that it's just this struggle. Wherever a seed might cling onto and take root, there's a struggle to be all that that plant can be. Do we have a similar devotion in our souls and our hearts, in the lives that God has given us, in the places that He has placed us? Okay, to back up a bit, just to understand sort of where we are in Daniel and what's going on, just a quick context here. God created us for relationship with Him. And He did so through this physical nest. In other words, there was the universe, there's a solar system, there's planet Earth. Amongst the water, there's land. In the land, there's vegetation. With the vegetation, there's this animal life. And in the middle of this is a garden, Eden, a place of special fellowship between Creator and created, a place for intimacy and trust and doing life and growing in that aspect. Well, because of our desire to go our own ways, that nest was sort of canceled. That we're strangers in a strange land, living in a world that's alien, that is based on sin and selfishness and blindness. Yet God in His redemption has created other nests, other places in the midst of the chaos for us to have a relationship. He did this with a covenant with His people in the Old Testament, calling a person and a family that grew to be a nation, to show people in the midst of where we all suffer and where we're hurting and broken, and the questions that we ask, the why have you forsaken me? This is what it looks like to do life with Yahweh. This is what it looks like to have real hope and to flourish. It's real. It's not make-believe. It's not projection, but it's cashed out in life. And so that's what it was to be the people of God. And God said, in this nest, in this covenant, in this commitment, this love relationship, this is going to be the enduring nature because of who I am, my heart, my character. It's what God says to us. And to live in the fullness of that's that faith walk and that trust and obedience. But in choosing to trust other things and other gods and keep our options open and the rebellion unresolved, there's consequences of that as well. And so where we are in the story of the people of God, of whom we're all a part, we have now God raising up a king, the king turning into, or the kingdom becoming divided, and just consequences of God needing to, in His mercy, discipline some really persistent poor choices. And so what was going on is people were just swayed by whatever the power was. They voted their pocketbook. If things were going well, they loved the king. Didn't matter if he was a godly king or not. If things weren't going well, they complained against God. Assyria and Egypt were the big power brokers, and so they do anything to whose side are we on, and it was a lot of patriotism, and who are we going to influence, whose protection are we coming under. And just through trusting in all these other things than God, what happened now by the time we get to Daniel is 10 of the 12 tribes are completely wiped out by Assyria and taken away, and they're gone. And then we have the southern kingdom holding on, but they just will not let go of their idols. And so God gives the ultimate cure, and that's exile. Just like we weren't supposed to have these alien influence in this intimate relationship with God, so He cast them as strangers in an alien place, that they would learn to cast themselves back on Him. God called Abram out of what we call modern-day Iraq, Babylon, or the Chaldees. And we find later on in the story that all the followers from the very beginning had been taking household idols with them, had their own backup plans. I'll trust you, God, but just in case. And it wasn't a wholehearted devotion. And these foreign influences and idols continued to grow and just choke out life. And so what God is doing is returning to the scene of the crime, so to speak, that they would learn finally there is only one God who loves them, who made them, who cares for them, who can set them free, who can give them true life. But it's got to be done in this relationship of obedience and trust. And so what Daniel is the beginning of this exile where God's people they never thought this would ever happen to them. They were completely dependent and vulnerable and hurting. And now God is working His story through some very unexpected teenagers and showing His commitment through all of this. This is about 605 BC would be the time period, and that the hammer has just fallen, where there's this exile in Babylon, the power. I just thought I'd have to have a map because we're doing an intro Not really sure if that's the right map. It might be. But it's this whole Tigris-Euphrates area. Well, that kingdom expanded because Babylon wanted to conquer Egypt, and Judah was in the way. And so on a national scale, power brokers are playing their games, but God is still very much involved with his people. So some artifacts from Babylon. It was the frightening kingdom of the time. They destroyed Assyria, and everybody was just in awe of this kingdom. That's the Ishtar Gate, one of the main gates to the capital. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So this is huge. They're going to what they thought was the center of the world, but it was an alien place for them because God was teaching them. Okay? Jumping in. See, this was a 70 years of captivity that God had foretold them, saying, look, this is going to happen. It's going to be a hot moment. I'm not going to lie to you, but I am with you. I am for you, and it's necessary. That would be a wholehearted devotion. Those that were cured by it, those that returned from the exile, it was worship. It was just the continuing story of God, of whom we're all connected. 95% of the people of God never learned a lesson. They fell in love with the world, and they just wanted to stay there. We saw this in Hebrews. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So the book of Daniel is really those being trained by God's discipline for a harvest of righteousness, for a real-time faith walk in areas that are so out of their control. So we're going to be here for a number of weeks. Why study the book of Daniel? Again, Old Testament, happened long ago. We remember maybe some famous stories, but really, why study? One, we see the larger workings of God, where life makes sense. We can be overwhelmed by the headlines or by our immediate circumstances or whatever, and realize that this is what God has always done with his people, that he is using the broad strokes of history to form our hearts individually and collectively toward him. So it normalizes the lives that we lead. We see prophecy and fulfillment and purpose, and God speaking hundreds of years. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. It strengthens our faith when we see some amazing and ridiculous prophecies being fulfilled, both in the book of Daniel and then stuff that's said in the book of Daniel that happened frighteningly, realistically, just as it was told. And so it helps to strengthen our faith in that way. We see how individuals can have lives of passion and meaning, and it's not dependent on circumstances. It's not dependent on, I've made so many bad choices, I'm just down and out. But it is a newness and redemption wherever we are. We can understand at times of apparent defeat and humiliation and hopelessness, where God, because he is unchanging, can do his best work with us. Stuff we never thought was possible, that we would be willing to allow him to have his way with us. And we see the consequences of obedience. Now, it's drawn out in some pretty remarkable stories, but it is a straightforward telling of a relationship of a heart inclined to God. Does faith make a difference? And who is this God that comes after us? So let's jump into the story. I believe it's 873 in your pew Bibles, if you want to follow along, or somewhere close to there. I'll have the text up here, and see what we can learn from Daniel 1. All right. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, love that name, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Okay? It's just a real matter-of-fact, dry historical account. This is what's going on. This is what happened. But it's told this way because everybody understands what is going on. The readers of this originally, they knew the backstory. They knew what was going on. Okay? Oh my goodness, I'm out of control here. All right, well, we'll see how that goes. Okay, good. The story's laid out where the king came, besieged the city, destroyed the temple, removed the stuff that was, necessary for serving God, was a source of the people's identity, tucked it away in a foreign temple. The account, like I said, is matter of fact, but two horrors undergird this. One is the unbelievable destruction of the temple. How could this be? This is the identity of the people of God. We're invincible. God himself dwells on our land, in our city, in our capital, in this temple. There is Yahweh. We are called. We are special. We're elect. Doesn't matter what I do. I've got my get out of jail free card. I've got Yahweh here. And so it was just this vindication. Nothing's going to change. God is going to protect us no matter what. And so when the temple was destroyed, as God said this was going to happen, people were absolutely psychologically traumatized. All bets were off. Everything that they thought they could count on was swept away. The rug pulled out from under them. Could they trust this God? What was real? Was their faith real? Were they just kidding themselves and playing nice and going to church just because that's what everyone did and it was safe? And now everything is thrown into question. And then it talks about he went to the city, he besieged it. This was a horrific military invasion. It was absolutely, absolutely terrible. Psalm 137 puts it this way. This is a psalm that was written just after this first deportation happened. So the people were deported and they're being tormented by their captors. So the psalm goes this way. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There in the poplars we hung our harps. Or there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Oh, wait a second, you're not there. Sucks to be you. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy, literally it says blessed. Blessed is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. That's what happened to them. Babies, infants torn out of mother's arms. It's just smashed sadistically against rocks just because it was a marauding army driven with bloodlust. And so the people were wounded, traumatized, broken. There was horror going on. So it wasn't this magical land and with princes in a palace and what's going to happen. It was the devastation of man at his worst. Where is God when it all comes undone? Story continues. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. See, the empire needed people that understood the culture, understood the language, and could serve them in keeping Judah down as this just cowed enemy. And so they took the best and the brightest. So we have these young men. They were high school student age, 16 perhaps. These four people that we're going to get to know throughout the book. And they were taken forcibly into the king's custody, and they were going to be trained to serve the enemy. It would be like the best and the brightest Jews going to work for the Gestapo, right? So that's what was being asked of these people. So not only had they endured the horror, not only are they questioning what is real, what's going on, but they were put in this very difficult situation, but that too by the Lord. What was going on in the bigger picture here was a fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah, way back, when God is saying, please stop going this way. Please trust me. Please put away your idols. This is killing you. And he said, this is the results. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all your predecessors have stored up to this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord, and some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away. Daniel and others, and they will become eunuchs or stewards in the palace of Babylon. Eunuch at this time probably didn't mean castrated. It just meant a steward in the court. And so God said, this is what's going to happen. And so we have these four teenagers that were taken, and they had to fight to the death for food amongst all the other districts. And no, I'm getting, maybe that's confused with Hunger Games, I'm not sure. So, but they were tributes, right? They were tributes offered to the king from their district of Judah. And their life was no longer their own. But what they were to discover is their lives ultimately were never their own. So they had to learn Akkadian. Akkadian is this right here. We notice cuneiform, that's those wedges that are stuck into clay. They had to learn to read and write this. Okay, they shared a common language, Aramaic. This is the language that Jesus spoke. This is what Daniel and his friends spoke. It's what they spoke in the palace in Babylon. But in order to serve as a clerk, they had to learn to read and write this stuff. 3-year program, or it's back to being a slave. So we're going to look at a few things very quickly. 1, to be incarnational, to fully show up in our lives, what Jesus did when he came. Okay, to be incarnational, we need to be sure who we aren't. Who we aren't. Okay? This is just absolutely amazing. Verse 6, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Okay, so we read this, it's pretty straightforward. Okay, they couldn't pronounce the Hebrew names perhaps, or maybe they just wanted to give them identity. When I was serving on a foreign team, we just could not pronounce any of the Korean names. It was painful to the Koreans to hear as butcher, unsub, unte, hente. It tried. And so they just would roll their eyes and go, I'm Peter. Hi, I'm Sam. So that could be what's going on here with them. But what do these names really mean? Okay, you're familiar that there's some significance put on names in the Old Testament. What's going on here? We have Daniel, God is my judge. Well, he's renamed to Bel, which is a foreign god like Baal of Canaan, or Marduk. Bel, protect his life. So it's no longer you're going to be known as God as your judge. Yahweh is the Lord over all, and he's going to judge you, and that's how you live your life. Forget that. That's the old person. The new person now, Satan, protect him. Hananiah means Yahweh has shown grace. And so he's renamed the command of Aku. Aku is a Sumerian moon god. Okay, frightening character. A lot of blood sacrifice and stuff demanded. So now renamed the command of Aku. Mishael, who is what God is. It's a great evangelistic name. So he's renamed who is what Aku is. And Azariah, I think it means you do voiceover for The Simpsons, Hank Azaria. Yahweh has helped. Now it's the servant of Nebo, okay, a Babylonian god. It doesn't seem that there's any issue here. They're going to take issue with something, next paragraph. They don't take issue with this. In other words, they're clear who they are on the inside. I know who I am. And so if you want to call me Satan as Lord, that's your problem, okay? You're wrong. But it's not going to affect me. It's not going to change me. And so they took these pagan foreign names named after foreign gods and demons. They didn't have a problem with that. They knew who they weren't. And so their identity wasn't bound up in how other people saw them or the names that other people placed on them or the labels that the world affixed to them. That didn't sway them at all because they had a clear sense of identity and they knew who they weren't. It's not on the outside. It's not what other people think. It did not define them, and they could let it go. To be incarnational, we also need to be sure who we are. Okay, equally important. And so here they take issue with something. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord, the king who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Again, I think this just shows God's a vegetarian. We have peace with our Lord through Jesus Christ, right? Isn't that the verse? I'm not sure. That would be the superficial reading of this, but we need to realize a couple things. It says they're getting food from the king's table. Now, it sounds like there's just this gourmet 12-course meal, and it's eye of pheasant, and wing of bat, and it's brought out here, and the king tastes it, and from the king's table, here's some lobster tail and some prime rib. That's not what it means. It simply means food rations that the government's paying for. Okay, so they're getting prison food, but the government's picking up the tab. But strangely enough, there's nothing in Jewish dietary law that prohibits them from eating meat, from drinking wine. There's nothing religiously that would cause an issue. So we're not sure why this was a red flag for Daniel, but they drew the line. He said, if you want to call me Satan as Lord, whatever, but I'm not eating meat from the king's table. Okay, maybe because it was sacrificed in pagan temples to demons, the wine was poured out as a libation, so part of it was sort of, you're pouring out some 40, for your buddies, and, your toast, and then the rest of the wine is served to the troops. That's what was going on. So maybe it was that association that he's just saying, look, I'm not going there. I think it was because of this clear sense of identity, he said, I am a child of God, and I'm to be set apart. I'm to be different. And what the government was trying to do was just to grind down all identity and assimilate them completely. And he said, look, you know what? What you call me on the outside, that doesn't matter. But I know who I am, and this is going to be a bridge too far from me. I'm going to lose what it means to be set apart. And I would rather just eat mush and maybe wither away than to have food to make me strong. It's not worth it. And so that's where he draws the line. It's individual choice. It's a choice of conscience. And God meets him there. And so gives them the strength that the food was giving others and gives it beyond that. It was that clear sense of identity that enabled them to navigate well this hall of mirrors and what is real and what isn't and where is God. And so they knew, this much I know, this is going to be too much. Others may, I cannot. And God met them and rewarded them. Finally, we see this. When we are incarnational, God is mediated to the people around us. Okay, we looked at in Easter week because one of the things that was so compelling and attracting about Christ is he was a whole person who showed up. He was there. He was fully connected, set apart, on mission. And you got a sense, wow, there's a reality here that isn't distracted, that isn't confused, that isn't saying one thing here and working it out, but just this clear devotion. Okay? And this is really God's role, the same incarnation that he has for all of us, that he would work in, through, and amongst us as a community. So finishing up the narrative, starting at 17. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time, so 3 years later, set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal. Okay, this is Babylon. This is the world-renowned power for court wizards and astrologers and science and philosophy and wisdom, and the king relied heavy on this. This is a premium. And in all the experts of the land, none were equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered into the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Could this be a supernatural revelation? Certainly. But he was saying at the end of 3 years of hard, dedicated service, they had shown themselves approved. They studied. They learned. This is where God has placed us. And think about the turnarounds in their lives. They grew up as nobility. So they grew up in the capital, and they lived a life of privilege. At the time at which this captivity happened, there was a huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. The poor and the marginalized were forgotten, spit upon, squeezed out. The nobility couldn't care less. They didn't even see them. And so God completely takes this away. They endured the horrors of war. They're taken from their family. They're taken to the pagan capital, and they're told to study. And so they knew who they were, and they said, I can't control this. I don't understand this. I don't like this. I'm wrestling with many things. But this much I can say. This is where God meets me. And so what they were able to do, the little bit in which they were able to respond, God so meets them way beyond anything they could imagine, that they're going to be instrumental in determining the course of nations and God, and a mouthpiece for God's plan for the Messiah coming, and so many things way beyond. And it was their faithfulness. Do we have a clear sense of who we are today? Do we have an undivided sense of self and calling and purpose that God has deliberately taken us and placed us to grow us, that we would know His love, that we would know Him, that we would grow in trust, that we could be purposed accordingly? What in our lives, what in our weekly experience helps us to lay hold of this? Gives us an increasing vision of who God is. In the good times when He gives, and in the heartbreak when He takes away. And the things we agree with, whether it's a sense of, yeah, wow, I get it, or the things that we just do not and perhaps never will be able to understand. What allows Him to work more through us as we serve others? What teaches us His truth and helps all the areas of our life to align with that which makes sense and fits? What helps our hearts to be more like God's in how He sees others? What secures the relationships that He's placed in our life and the responsibilities that He's given us? What enables us to lay hold of all that He's given? I don't know about you, but I think having moved so many times, having had a constant sense of change, the identity thing's a tough one. I have to ask sometimes, who am I and what is that based on? Is it just a matter of circumstance and growing up in church? Is it just a matter of losing things, that they're more valuable to me and having a greater appreciation? Is it a sense of feeling in limbo and just when I get the answers, they change the questions? What determines my identity? And it keeps coming down to this. There's so many things about me that I'd love to change that I can't. There's so many things around me that I would love to control. I can't, most likely. There's so many things that I have to influence and do and make happen. Really isn't going to happen. I have to admit my own powerlessness. But I also have to admit that it doesn't end there. It begins there. That God uniquely has placed me, as we've looked at before when we're looking at Hebrews, looking at 1 Corinthians, deliberately placed us in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our work situations or not work situations, in our health situations or not health situations. We don't get to control any of that necessarily. But we do get to respond, and we get to respond in God's strength. We get to respond with God's wisdom. We get to respond with His faithfulness. And I can say a lot may have just been ripped up in my life, but the rock that is higher than me, I can at least stand on that. That there's stability, that there is hope, that there is a joy, and there's a peace that I don't have to understand, but I can rest in. We are all going to experience loss in this life. We've all experienced loss if we've drawn breath for any more than a few weeks. That is the nature of a world that is winding down, that is not the way it should be, that worships everything than its creator. But God in His mercy has stepped into this broken situation, into our broken lives, that the glory that He wants to manifest, the fullness, that clarity, that sense of freedom, we can be who we were made to be. I don't have to do everything that I want to do. I can be who I am instead in Christ because of His power, not because of my track record. Because He knows who I am, not because of all the labels that I accept sometimes all too willingly from other people, but who I am in His eyes. And that is our hope and our strength. And so as we move through the book of Daniel, we're going to see some tremendous stories. But don't let the fireworks, don't let the roller coaster obscure what God is doing, because it's the same thing in all of our lives. Situations, much of which we don't like, much of which we'd want to change, and much of which we cannot. But that is where God can do His absolute best work, because we're most vulnerable, We are willing to give that which is most valuable to us, that we can receive much more from God. And we see it played out tremendously in Daniel. And we see God's heart for us, giving back the locust years, filling us with a love and a hope way beyond, and walking with us as he gives, as he takes away, as we understand, and especially when we don't, every day of our lives. Let's pray. God, it is so daunting looking at the stage upon which we live our lives. It is so complex. It is so rapid. It fluctuates. So much going on in the world stage, and yet who are we? But God, you're not impressed by nations, by pop culture, by all the things that influence our lives. But you are blessed by a heart inclined to you. That you are blessed by a sacrifice, smelly fish, crust of bread, that you can take, break, bless, multiply, and that we could know your Father's heart rejoicing over us. We could know what it is to be whole and complete, works in progress, discovering real time where you do your best work in redemption, in healing, in recreation. In Jesus' name, we thank you and we praise you. Amen.